You know, unlike every other month of Fire Emblem Heroes, December tends to be some of the most jam-packed when it comes to brand new releases, skills, etc. Mainly because we get one extra banner in the form of the New Year's banner. That being said, if you just completely remove that, I would argue this was still one of the more jam-packed months that we had this year, just because of how overloaded they were in general. Anywho, you know the drill, you read the title, you saw the thumbnail, you probably did something to get on this video. Let's get right into it, and by right into it, I mean you can skip to this part of the video, which is going to be in the description, if you want to go immediately to any of the tier lists. For anybody who isn't familiar though, hi, hello, this is the monthly Grail tier list update. Over the course of this video, I'm going to be going over 3 individual tier lists made by myself, one for Aether raids, one for Summoner Duels, and one for Arena, and based on the unit placements across each of the tier lists, we'll determine a cumulative ranking at the end of the video, and my own personal recommendations for units that I would recommend building at this time. It is worth mentioning though that these lists are considered at max investment, so if resources prove to be an issue for you, then you could always just strike off any sort of old unit that may be harder to build than any sort of newer edition. That being said, if you only care for a certain mode, then you can take any of the lists on their own individual basis. Other than that, there's really not much else to it. You will see sword symbols ranked accordingly to some of the units, and that just means they're ranked with their PRF in mind. If they don't have it, they're using an inheritable. And if you have any other questions or feedback, leave it in the comments and I'll get to them as soon as I can. But with that said, we may as well get right into the Aether raids tier list. Now, as far as new additions go to Aether raids, tanks have become even worse because of Legendary Camilla, who can now grant everybody shred damage. You know, something like physical no follow, magical no follow, attack res tempo 4, anything that just halves the process of damage reduction in general. Everybody can get it as a visible status. On top of the fact that she is a flyer, you can pair her with stuff like Legendary Hinoka and Arian for the extra charge, and effectively run teams with massive threat ranges and ability to get through damage reduction regardless of their archetype. At the very least, this gives more nuking viability to a lot of other archetypes that didn't have access to shred. That being said, enemy phasing is more or less a commodity at this point, and I wouldn't really recommend it in Aether raids if you have the ability to do any sort of player phase niche. We also got the addition of Ratatasker, who is more or less, for all intents and purposes, a Astra Gatekeeper. So now you can run Gatekeeper in Light Season and the new Mythic in Astra Season, and you don't necessarily have to swap him in between every season. The only big difference is that she has to apply terrain in order to prevent warping, which isn't going to be hard given its big range. So now if you're worried about stuff like Arian, Hinoka, or anybody with warping capabilities, well, now you don't necessarily have to worry about it as much, as now you just have a free-to-play Gatekeeper going around. You also have 2 incredibly awesome additions in Arcane Threma and No Quarter, the former just being an incredibly flexible weapon despite having a speed-based no follow-up effect. It has full tempo, a bunch of stats, a global debuff, and sabotage. You can give this weapon to almost every single unit, even if you aren't taking advantage of the no follow-up effect, because everything else on there is still incredibly powerful and doesn't require a speed check. Meanwhile, with No Quarter, this is just another layer on top of the DR piercing cake, where now every sword, lance, and axe can have access to piercing specialists. Isn't that really fun? They've really been honing in on this null damage reduction meta for quite some time at this point. But you also have stuff like true damage reduction, which thankfully can't get pierced, but true damage reduction on its own isn't exactly the grandest. Even so, with the addition of Dragonstone Plus and New Sunstone, every dragon can have some sort of access to true damage reduction, whether it's based on their speed or their attack. And for a lot of the characters that were mostly relying on something like Arcane Grima for the longest while, I would argue that these are significantly stronger weapons just on the defensive side. Even if you don't get a guaranteed follow-up and there's no slaying, there is much more benefit to running these true damage reduction weapons for enemy phase purposes, which is pretty much what most of their archetype is built around anyway. But you also have other player phase skills such as Assassin's Strike and Attack Speed Wild. Assassin's Strike is more or less just the physical version of Occultist Strike. Now everybody just gets free pre-combat damage with true damage on top of that and stats, and yeah, so even for units that have true damage reduction, this can get through them very, very easily. It's free damage for the sake of it because, yep, that's totally fair game. It's super fair. This is part of the reason why enemy phase strats are just suffering as much as they are. Units that can run Flared Sparrow and Assassin's Strike all the time are just going to be getting free damage regardless of the combat outcome, and it will eventually just whittle them down to the point where they may not even be able to function as an enemy phase unit, especially if they have 25% HP conditions attached attached to it. And before getting to my favorite addition of the month, we have Attack Speed Wild, which isn't exactly going to bring Beast back into the spotlight, but as far as Aether Raid's offense threats are concerned, I think this is an incredibly awesome skill for Gale Force strategies, more specifically on Light Season because of Asker granting free cooldown to every sort of character near him. Attack Speed Wild, as long as you're transformed, you will get cooldown per attack, which means that even in a scenario where you don't have a good amount of attack or you don't have a good amount of speed, even though the skill is dedicated to attack and speed, you will be able to Gale Force with much more ease than anybody who still has to make a speed check, which is still an incredibly awesome addition for a lot of Beast units. And lastly, we have the Distant Counter Melee Seal, which, wow, this was a whole thing of its own. I made a whole separate video on that if you want to check that out, but the TLDR is that every sword, lance, and axe can use it. This is an incredibly massive buff for your infantry enemy phase tanks and for your armor specifically. In my opinion, the latter succeeds with it way more just because of their ability to loop party fighter specials, but you can still slap this on any good infantry and they should be able to work with it relatively well. That being said, with how much they've hampered on enemy phase strats, you're going to have to be a bit more careful. But going on to the brand new units and refines, we had Iago, Valadar, Winter Claude, and New Year Kana. Iago surprisingly got a really solid refine that can be applied in pretty much every single mode outside of preferably arena because he isn't exactly a great score bot there. That being said, Iago's tome retains the whole turn gimmick. It'll inflict penalties and debuffs depending on what turn it is, but now with the added benefit of granting allies within 2 spaces an additional gimmick. On one turn, it could be nullifying every single visible bonus on a foe during combat, and on another turn, it could be Hexblade, which for a free-to-play, that's incredibly good, especially since there's not really any setup required outside of being within 2 spaces of an ally, which is probably one of the easiest things to do in the game. As far as his combat is concerned, I don't think it's bad at all. He gets a guaranteed follow-up, he gets extra stats. If anything, Aether Raids as a whole isn't exactly helping out a lot of infantry at the moment, but he could either be a decent prime setup user or just provide a lot of defense units with a lot more gimmicks to make their combats even more deadly than they already are. Meanwhile, with Valadar, he just gets a lot of true damage. He has a really solid min-max stat line. He inflicts Discord and Panic unconditionally, and if a bunch of foes around them have a good amount of penalties, then he'll just get a load of true damage. Simple stuff for the most part, but it does its job extremely well. You can more or less think of them as the same unit, except one is a lot more modern and definitely leans into their combat a lot more, while the other one is a lot more supportive in nature. But even that aside, they're both incredibly solid units at this time. Meanwhile, you have Winter Claude and New Year Kana. Both of them are generic, but I wouldn't say either of them are particularly bad. Winter Claude introduced Golden Yule Bow, which is a really solid upgrade for pretty much every single armor in the game. Because of its ability to grant 3 quick impulses, you can set up really solid miracle strats if the goal is to just survive. Enemy phasing is not an easy thing to do at this point, so if you're trying to at least survive one combat, then that just means it's one less action for your foe to take advantage of, and in my opinion, that's still a really solid thing to do. Foe initiates, you survive 1 hit, Golden Yule Bow will turn Miracle into a 1 cooldown special, you retaliate back, it becomes charged, and then at that point you don't have to worry about it. Meanwhile, with New Year Kana, she's more or less just relegated to enemy phase strategies, but at the same time, she still has a good amount of Dragon Seals going for her. She has Dragonstone Plus, which grants 20% true damage reduction on her speed, attack speed finish, counter roar, pledge, distant counter. She has everything for the makings of an enemy phase unit, but the problem is that she's an enemy phase unit, which in some scenarios should be fine, but you have to be a lot more careful because everything can just have piercing at this point. But even that aside, as a free-to-play, more or less Dragon Brave Dimitri, it's not a bad thing whatsoever. But if we're talking about other units that really benefit from this update, we have all the Axe Infantry who can run Arcane Threma Gale Force strategies, where the idea is that they go in one tap. You don't even have to run Quick Impulse in their Sacred Seal if you have Asker, because as long as they're able to make a speed check, then they're going to be able to charge Gale Force with relative ease. Or if you don't even want to run Flash Sparrow and you would rather run some other skill, you could keep Quick Impulse, and Arcane Threma will still allow you to get the Gale Force on the 1 cooldown because of the full tempo built into it. And moving forward in Aether Raids, I find that Gale Force strategies or any sort of player phase strat is going to be incredibly necessary for you to succeed. Even though, again, there are scenarios where you could enemy phase, it's definitely going to be a lot more hit or miss because of how unreliable the strategy is at this time. And this also doesn't apply to the infantry axes. You could also use it with Mordecai, who, while definitely doesn't have the speed stat comparatively, still has full tempo in his weapon, can still charge up Gale Force relatively easily because he's an infantry, and because attack speed wild is unconditional cooldown as long as he transforms, which isn't going to be that hard for somebody like auto follow-up Wings of Mercy Gale Force. He's going to be able to charge up Gale Force very easily. Some might argue it might be easier than the Axe Infantry, but as far as charges are concerned, it's definitely going to be a bit harder. That being said, the full tempo from his weapon makes him at least a decent enough one-shotter for Gale Force strategies, and it's something I would definitely recommend if you are looking to build him in a way that isn't just enemy phasing. You can also do the same thing with the Beast Cabs, with the key differences being their ability to run Arcane Nihility and have a really solid speed stat, so they could reliably double and don't have to necessarily worry about either running Asker, although they could of course if they wanted to, or struggle to double and will get doubled in the process. As far as Beast Gale Forcers are concerned, they aren't in a bad position at this moment, but also in a similar vein to somebody like Winterclad, you could still slap Golden Yule Bow on a lot of the other armor bows and do the same thing that he was doing. They don't have the modern stat line that he does, but relatively speaking, they should be able to perform the same way as he would. Even in a scenario where they just have to reliably survive one hit, they should be able to because of Weaving Fighter's 80% first hit damage reduction. And going more into Golden Yule Bow's offensive capabilities, with the likes of Arian, Legendary Hinoka, and even Legendary Camilla, depending on who you want to attack on, you can have Flared Sparrow, Assassin Strike, Deadly Miasma coverage with any sort of bow flyer. Golden Yule Bow with charge will make it so they get an instant Deadeye, and whether or not you choose to run Legendary Camilla alongside it, you'll get the additional benefit of Shred, which even though Deadeye should be able to take care of that, in scenarios where you may be going up against somebody with Veil support or Scowl support, you'll still be able to get a good amount of damage out, and generally speaking, they should be able to nuke a lot of stuff in the enemy phase as long as it isn't going directly into a hardy fighter, which is still entirely probable, but as far as flyer line nukes are concerned, they aren't in a bad position at this time. The same thing could also be applied to all the bow cabs too. The only big difference is that they have natural 3 movement, so you don't have to worry about charge. You can still give them Legendary Camilla support. If you don't even want to run Deadeye, you can run Luna instead, and you'll more or less be doing the same thing, stacking as much stats as possible, pre-combat damage, Deadeye, Luna, whichever the case may be. The idea is that you're just going to be trying to one-shot with all the free damage and true damage that you're going to be getting anyway. But other than that, it's another relatively decent amount of promotions based on Arcane Threma, again related to Gale Force. It's going to be another case of either being a Gale Force setup, maybe with somebody like Grimmarth or Plagueing Chris with Double Fury, Snag, Arcane Threma. The benefit of having full no follow-up in it means that as long as you just have the one cooldown, you won't really have to worry about charging Gale Force whatsoever. Or of course you could still do the Wings of Mercy auto follow-ups up with any of your infantry. They aren't as fast as the other ones, which is why I don't have them in the same tier, but they can still perform the same niche as a lot of the other ones. But other than that, I ended up demoting Kempf and Wallheart. It's not necessarily because they aren't the best units, they no longer fulfill a niche that needs filling, whereas before you could prevent stuff like Godlike Reflexes users, they don't necessarily survive as is, so the benefit of running something like Wolfberg or Venin Edge is no longer as prominent as it once was. And now for a brand new segment, a lot of people may have been wondering what kind of season should I be using all these units on, because there are a lot of units in this game, there are a lot of mythics in this game, some units do this, some units do that on better seasons. I found that this is probably going to be a nice enough resource for people to reference if they are planning to build any sort of unit regardless of their performance in said mode, because even just looking at this list, there are a lot of things to consider, especially for people who aren't as familiar with Aether rates, and putting everything into one singular image is definitely going to make the process of it a lot better. But if you wanted to reference one thing, in my opinion, these are probably the best seasons for each of these individual characters, whether it's because their niche maybe such as Gale Force 6 in something like Light over Astra, some units prefer to be ran in something like Dark because of stuff like Emblem preventing saves, or something like if Flyer Lines in Anima because you have the ability to run Freyr and that can't be shut off. A lot of them are more or less going to be falling into one or two categories, but for the ones that want to be hyper specific, they are treated as Light, Dark, Astra, or Anima. So if you're ever wondering which season I should use certain characters on, this is a decent enough niche. I'll probably update it over time as well as we get newer additions, but as a general gist, I think these are probably some of the best seasons for them. And as far as Aether rates is concerned, I believe this is about it. Next, we have the Summoner Duels list. In my opinion, we're going to be seeing a lot of decent changes when it comes to armors because of the distant counter melee seal. Over the course of who knows how long at this point, armors have struggled to survive so much because of units like Wind Claude, Legendary Hinoka, anybody with piercing, which is Now, readily available to everybody, free damage from stuff like Assassin Strike and Flared Sparrow. It's just been extremely brutal for a lot of characters to just stay alive, and now with the distant counter melee seal, a lot of them are going to be able to loop defensive specials so that they can get double hardy fighter procs, and for the melee armors in particular, they absolutely benefit from this because of their ability to either run Arcane Chiang, Devour, or for the ones that don't have access to breath in their weapon, can run breath support very, very easily, or for axe armors who can run Thrima and shut off specials entirely. Although outside of the hardy fighter defensive looping prowess, there is one thing that I've always been critical of when it came to melee cavs, and it was their ability to actually function in a cav line. Comparatively to a lot of the other melee cavs that you would see in this mode, the reason that they're so common is because they either have gimmicks such as Legendary Chrom that would allow them to reach super far, or extremely good combat niches that would allow them to actually kill in the scenario that they are placed in. But now with the addition of No Quarter, a lot of them have the ability to pierce through a lot of damage reduction properties, and because no follow-up itself is a lot more common through guidance, they should be able to get away with a lot of guaranteed follow-up stuff. That being said, it's not always going to be the most consistent thing because there will be scenarios where full no follow-up is present. But that being said, No Quarter being allocated to every sort of sword, lance, and axe cav unit means that they could at least provide a niche on the cav line nowadays, which is something that I've been hoping for a long while. But other than that, it's more additions such as Assassin Strike, Weaving Fighter, and Byleth in particular, who's going to be extremely annoying as a far save going forward, and Legendary Camilla, who again still has the spoil rotten gimmick of granting everybody shred. Byleth and Camilla are units you're going to have to watch out for probably a good long while, especially the latter because of her what's arguably going to be timeless support. Unless they litter stuff like dual Thor gimmicks up the wazoo, she's going to be extremely prevalent for a good while. You also have Yunaka with, again, Assassin Strike. Even though as a unit she's still incredibly good herself, Assassin Strike is definitely just something to make tanking a lot more difficult. But now with the addition of Weaving Fighter and special looping gimmicks such as distant counter melee, they should at least have a better chance at doing that. But now going into the newer additions, we have Iago and Valadar once again, who in my opinion succeed so much more in this mode because now they're going to be able to take advantage of their combative niche much more easily. Before in Aether raids, in my opinion, there really wasn't a benefit to running either of them outside of the supportive gimmicks, which were still relatively good in their own right. The problem was that they didn't have the threat range, and that was stuff like Gatekeeper, Ruse 4, Ratatasker, and the complete shift to Flyer and Cav lines. I find that they weren't really able to take advantage of their gimmicks as much, but in something like Summoner Duels where Katria is still freely roaming around, not only will they have a solid combative niche, but they're able to provide so much solid support that, in my opinion, they're probably some of the better Grail options available to you at this time for that mode specifically. Meanwhile, with Winter Claude and New Year Kana, they're definitely going to be struggling a bit more because of how enemy phase oriented they are. Winter Claude not having access to any sort of hardy fighter gimmicks definitely makes their ability to tank much more difficult, but at the very least they do have Golden Yule Bow Miracle gimmicks, and as long as they don't get quadded and they are able to get Miracle off on the foe's second hit, presumably if they are able to double, then he should be able to survive the one combat and it shouldn't be that big of an issue after that point. That being said, with New Year Kana, the best you're really going to be able to do is make her a near save with Soren, which is not bad by any means, of course. But as far as enemy phase niches are concerned, you could definitely do a lot better than an enemy phase dragon, and as a raid boss, she definitely isn't going to succeed because of how common Shred is at this point. But you could still definitely use these units if you really wanted to make them work. Of course, given how I was praising the distant counter melee seal a lot earlier, as well as Iago and Valadar, it's no shock that I promoted them all the way up to the highest tier possible, mainly because they provide so much to the mode in my opinion. Flame Emperor already has a really solid weapon in Flame Battle Axe. It is a guard weapon with a visible sabotage penalty, a lot of daunt, debuffs, so on and so forth. And now with the distant counter melee seal, outside of units like Legendary Hinoka, they should be able to counter back and loop something like Sacred Cow as long as they have breath support, which means their survivability is going to be not only significantly higher, but they're also able to provide a decent enough supportive niche that makes them stand out amongst every other armor in the Grail shop. And because of that, I ended up promoting them. Meanwhile, with Iago and Valadar, it's pretty much the reasons as I explained earlier with them. They have really good combat niches on the Katria ball, and to provide solid support for them to at least stand out comparatively to a lot of other nukes in the Grail shop. But even that aside, I also promoted a lot of the melee armors again because of their ability to run Hardy Fighter Aegis looping with the disencounter melee seal. The Lances arguably have it the best because of the free guaranteed follow-up and breath built into the weapon, so they should be able to loop it with relative ease, but you could still run something like Arcane Devour on a sword. Even if they don't get the guaranteed follow-up, they still get the breath effect, so they should be able to get a double Aegis with relative ease as long as there isn't a guard effect. Worst case scenario, you run Sacred Cowl and you should be able to get that no matter what. You also have Arcane Threma, which can still be used with Sacred Cowl strats. You don't really have to worry about the breath effect, and with the built-in tempo and sabotage, they should still have a relatively solid amount of survivability. That being said, not running Surveillance Shield may be a bit of a detriment as long as you're not running into Legendary Hinokas. Otherwise, you should be fine in a lot of scenarios. But other than that, you have units like Winter Felix and Winter Jabbar, who again could take advantage of Miracle strats because of Golden Yule Bow and Weaving Fighter. That's the main reason they're being promoted as well to the decent tier, alongside Winter Claude, who can still do this arguably the best because of Golden Yule Bow and a modern stat line. But for all intents and purposes, they should be able to fulfill a similar niche, even if some of them aren't nearly as great as the other ones. As long as they're able to survive with the gimmick in tow, then I don't see the issue with it whatsoever. But other than that, most of the melee Cavs pretty much got a promotion because of no quarter and finally being able to fill a niche in a Cav line, which is something that all of them have been struggling for a really long while. No quarter being a 3 cooldown special means that alongside an arcane, as long as they are able to double, they will have no issue getting no quarter off whatsoever. And in my opinion, this was something that a lot of melee Cavs needed in order to at least perform in Summoner Duels, because otherwise they really weren't going to be doing much. In the past, there was always the idea of something like Clash with maybe something like Near Trace and some smoke setup, so that way you could at least be a really bulky frontliner. But at this point, it's really not feasible for them in particular since they aren't exactly the best defensively. But hey, now they got no quarter, which means they can pierce just like everybody else in the game. But you know what? It's something that was a much needed buff for them, and in my opinion, this is a really solid thing for them to at least perform in something like Summoner Duels. But other than that, I ended up demoting a lot of the Infantry Dragons and Beast Cavs because they don't really fulfill a niche that is really worth filling, and if there is something that they can do, then a lot of the other units in question can just do it significantly better. The Beast Cavs in particular also have no ability to run no quarter, which at that point means that they really shouldn't be ran a lot of the time, but at the very least with the Arcane Nihility, they may be able to do something. But as far as buffs are concerned for the mode, I think this was a really solid step in the right direction. That being said, it's going to be incredibly toxic still because that's what Summoner Duels is, so that's cool at least. But other than that, we have the Arena tier list, and the biggest highlight is again going to be Legendary Camilla, because she is a water legendary who can grant everybody Shred. This just means that a lot of your strategies going forward may have to rely on hit and run, just so you don't have to deal with something like Spoiled Rotten, because otherwise enemy phasing is just going to be near impossible for a lot of units. At the very least though, she is green, so it could still make a lot of your green tanks a lot more feasible in the enemy phase. But it is something you're going to have to watch out for regardless. If you want to try some hit and run strat, you could always try something like Legendary Chrom with To Change Fate. You have dancers such as Ninian and Legendary Azura. You even have hit and run strategies from something like Legendary Hinoka and Lilina, who have Kanto 1, although she isn't released with it yet, it is confirmed in her remix. It is something that you have strategies for if there are overlapping seasons, but it's definitely going to be a lot more difficult moving forward for enemy phase strats, so something to keep in mind for that season in particular. But hey, if you are looking to building any sort of unit for scoring purposes, then you have a lot more options because the Distant Counter Melee Seal boosted up so many units into the 764 and 762 bin that even relatively older units such as Young Boyd and Yenfei can still score relatively well because of the Distant Counter Melee Seal. Although the latter would be kind of ridiculous because of the double distant counter, it's still an option if you do want to score 760 BST and you have a plus 10 Yenfei lying around. But in my opinion, the top 4 score bots being Fargus, Kellum, Murdoch, and Vigard are insane just because hitting 764 BST on a free-to-play unit is very solid for scoring in general. And because of this giant BST boost, units like Valadar don't really have a chance in Arena. Outside of being a decent support unit, they aren't exactly the best when it comes to scoring. Even though you could argue 758 BST is still okay, in my opinion, it's not really worth it when you could get a free-to-play unit to score 764. And with how the Arena changes have been, I would try and go for units that have way higher BST than 758. But at the very least, units like Winter Claude and New Yorkana have 762 BST respectively, so if you did want to build them them up, then they are options at your disposal, and they have the benefit of not having to be locked to a PRF, so if they come out with better weapons in the future, then you could always swap them out and they'll be able to score the same. And taking the legendary chart into consideration, you may be wondering where you want to use any of these 4 new units in the arena if you do plan to run Iago, Valadar, Wintercloud, or Kana. And I can tell you this right now, I wouldn't bank on fire and water because I don't think they're really going to be doing all too much there. Earth and wind are probably going to be some of your best bets. For Wintercloud, you could run the triple unity stack strat with legendary Robin and the weapon that grants unity, although it's not completely necessary. With the addition of Weaving Fighter and Arcane Nastron, you should be able to shrug off a lot of stuff and get a good amount of stat swings regardless. That being said, the option is there, so just like a lot of the other generic bow armors who have to rely on enemy phase strategies, you still have the benefit of stacking up a significant amount of stats, which is why I would recommend Claude for Earth Season in particular. Though for the other 3, I would definitely recommend Wind Season in particular. Iago is a really solid Omega debuffer with sabotage support and can shut off the likes of legendary Eliwood's bonus doubler effects, so stat swings become even less of a nuisance comparatively. Meanwhile, with Valadar, he could also provide a decent amount of support. He has good combat, and he can help your nukes secure even more kills because of Discord and Panic built into it. But with legendaries such as Gunthra and legendary Lucina, or even units like Veronica or legendary Yuri, you should be able to secure kills much more easily, or don't necessarily have to rely on setup as much. And then lastly, there's New Year Kana, who also fits in the Wind Season relatively well in my opinion because of the ability to run Scowl, the true damage inheritable weapon, and just having a relatively solid tanking color for that season because of the sheer dominance of red nukes in that season. You have stuff like legendary Alencia, Yuri, Veronica, who shouldn't be able to kill her that easily because of her color and the true damage reduction that she's getting from her weapon, on top of also having a really good res stat or even access to counter war, so you can get even more damage reduction properties that way. Basically make her a dragon brave Dimitri. And because she is a dragon, you could also run Eliwood support with relative ease because she meets the condition just for existing. In my opinion, these are probably some of the best seasons for these units, and as far as their relative seasons are concerned and arenas in general, I think this is probably going to be about it. If you did want to make any of these emerge projects, this is what I would consider the most. And lastly, to close off the video, we have my personal recommendations for merge projects. A lot didn't really change for the most part, even though, if anything, a lot of them just became even more useful in that regard. The only significant change here was removing Cyril from the arena focus and putting Vigard there instead, because not only does he score more than Cyril, but now with the distant counter melee seal, he has a relatively solid enemy phase niche outside of just being a score bot. Whereas Cyril definitely still had to rely on nuking from a Catria ball, which isn't something that he was able to take advantage of as easily in something like Aether raids. But as far as recommended projects are concerned, I would still recommend these 11 units in particular. Whether it's a really solid tanky melee flyer, a mixed phase utility one, or just one with a really solid gimmick that can't really be replicated that easily, units with solid mixed utility, whether that's providing additional support, combat, or tanking prowess, or units directly focusing on arena that also can perform in other modes with relative ease, I would recommend these 11 units in particular. But that's just my opinion. If you have any other thoughts or concerns regarding this list, let me know down below. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.